everyone, today I want to discuss a new topic. I know we've been doing a lot of esoteric magic and the dark arts and things like that, but I also really enjoy history as a topic. So today I wanted to discuss a bit about some of the most famous courtesans in history, why the courtesan is so alluring. Obviously, with most cultures, the courtesan is something that has existed and still does exist today. Some of my favorite periods in history with courtesans is obviously Venice, like the 1500s, the 16 and 1700s, for Versailles in France, and then in England as well in the 1800s. I think today we're going to try and really focus on France and the three Louis kings of France, the 14th, 15th, and 16th, and their respective mistresses. We're going to be talking about three of my favorite characters, though there were many more than just these three that I'm going to discuss today. We'll talk about why these women were so powerful and alluring in their time. The first woman, the first courtesan that we're going to discuss about today was Madame de Montespan. She was Louis XIV's mistress. She was born in 1640 to a noble family, so she had noble blood in her. She was part of nobility, which is very acceptable to her to be in the royal court at the time. She actually had 7 illegitimate children with Louis, which was very impressive. Some actually called her the true Queen of France. She had long blonde hair. She was very famous for having these wide blue eyes and flaxen blonde hair, which was quite rare back then, and it wasn't dyed or bleached or anything. It was just natural flaxen blonde hair. Her reign of the sort of supposed Queen of France / mistress was from 1667, when she first danced with Louis. She actually met him at a ball, and it's very much, I think, how they started to fall in love until the late sort of 1680s. I think one of her mistakes as a mistress that she made was she openly resented the Queen, who was Marie Theresa of Austria, and it was a big no to I think as a mistress at the time to insult the Queen or not be friends with the Queen. Making an enemy of the Queen was never a good idea, but it's certainly something she did, and very openly as well. She replaced another mistress who was called Louise, who had been very popular with the King for many years before her. I think Louise very much underestimated Madame de Montespan. She thought, this isn't a threat, it's not going to be a problem. But Madame de Montespan was a very charming and intelligent woman, and a lot of the reoccurring things that you'll notice throughout this video is that a lot of these courtesans are very intelligent, versed in the arts, and are patrons of the art. And I think with that intelligence is a very formidable quality. And so they have to deal with a lot of rivals in the royal court, obviously. And all of these, the three women that I'm going to be talking about today, all had to deal with very real rivals at the time. And a lot of them didn't have good outcomes, unfortunately. Being a mistress was a very glamorous occupation, and it provided a degree of independence. Most of these mistresses were actually already married. It was very common. Regardless, it was accepted by the king. In fact, in France, it was considered natural for the king to have many mistresses. If we look at something like Henry VIII, Tudor England, it was actually not so much acceptable to have a mistress because of the religious connotations. Here in France, as long as you repented on your deathbed and sent your mistress away, it was actually okay to publicly have mistress. It showed that the king was fertile, able to have children and reproduce, and by the general populace of the court at Versailles, it was considered a very good thing. So poor Louise, the other mistress, was replaced by Madame de Montespan. Madame de Montespan was already in her mid to late 20s at this point. Some people claim that she openly seduced the king by dropping her towel when she noticed that he was spying on her as she was showering. As I said before, she was married. She was married to another Louis, the Marquis de Montespan, and this was obviously considered okay at the time, as I said. She did fall into disrepute rather. She during her reign and everything was going well, she was granted the ability to live on the same floor as the Queen. They called them apartments in Versailles, and they were beautifully appointed rooms. She actually lived very close to the king, so that he could have easy access to her. He also gifted her chateaux and jewels. Some of her chateaux had hundreds of gardeners, to give you an idea of just how large these estates were, that the king gifted to her as a sign of how much he loved her. And she was, very well spoken and very charming. Everybody in the court really adored her, and actually she didn't have as many enemies as you might imagine as some of the other mistresses that we will be talking about. As I say, everything started to go wrong. She was accused of poisoning a duchess that the king fell in love with. I mean, historically now, we actually don't think that happened at all. It's believed the duchess died of natural causes, unfortunately for her, but she was definitely blamed for it. She was accused of doing rituals by taking babies and sacrificing them and using the blood of the newborn infants to make potions, and was accused of feeding them to the king for 12 years. In fact, they arrested a witch, and she testified saying that, that they dug up a garden. There were 2,500 bodies of infants found. Obviously, historically, there's been no evidence of this. We don't know for a fact if that actually happened or not. It seems very unlikely in my eyes, but nonetheless, much like Anne Boleyn, who was Henry VIII's wife, she was accused of being a witch, and likewise Madame de Montespan was accused of doing rituals. She was accused of doing in particular, a black mass ritual in which she was covered in blood, and a lot of people obviously believed this at the time, even though she had had these 7 children and had done very well by the king. Before she was really exiled, she was moved down from the apartments. One of the signs, if you are a courtesan, that you've fallen from grace, is that you're moved down in different levels in Versailles, in the palace. So her being moved down several levels was a sign of her fall from grace, a visual kind of representation. That's how she knew that she was doing bad at the time. She was obviously replaced by another mistress, as mistresses often and usually always are in history. And eventually she went to a convent in 1691. She was sent away, which was, in my opinion, very unfortunate. She was a fascinating character, a big fan of wearing perfume. As a lot of you know, Versailles really did not have great hygiene. It's sometimes a little known fact that courtiers used to just relieve themselves behind curtains or against walls, often in front of other people, because there were no real lavatories at the time, and there were no real restrooms, and so it was acceptable just to defecate and piss everywhere over the palace. It was completely normal, whereas today we would think it was horrific. They really didn't take baths back then. It was considered unhealthy and in fact dangerous to take baths. They didn't understand about cleanliness and bacteria in the way that we do today. They used to do a wipe down. They believed that the sign of being clean was how white your clothes were, how white were your linens. So they would take great care to wash the clothes, but less so themselves. They'd cover themselves in a lot of perfume. Actually, Louis became very averse to perfume. He actually accused Madame de Montespan in her later years, close to when she was exiled. He stated publicly in front of everyone, Madame, you wear far too much perfume, which was a sign of him sort of publicly snuffing her. The next famous courtesan slash mistress that we're going to discuss is probably the most famous of this entire trio we've got here, is Madame du Pompadour. She was Louis XV's chief mistress, so this is the son of the Sun King, and this was from 1745 until 1751. What's interesting about Madame de Pompadour is she's such a beautiful and charismatic lady. If we look at her portraits, she is an absolute knockout. She's really stunning, but she had a very low sexual libido. She actually didn't enjoy having sex at all, and she was very open about it with the king. She tried everything she could to increase her libido. we know for a fact from reports she would eat truffles and take vanilla, in an attempt to make herself more aroused for the king, but it just didn't work. She really wasn't in it. And in fact, in 1750, she actually ceased any kind of sexual role for king, which for any other courtesan would spell absolute disaster and kind of the end of the road, and they would usually be exiled or sent away. But Madame de Pompadour was very kind and very charismatic, and the king, he truly loved her. In fact, some people state that really, she was his only friend, and he trusted her more than anyone else in the entire world. And so even after they stopped having sex, they still continued a relationship. She became, as a title, the official friend of the king was her actual title, which she adopted. She had many enemies in court, a lot more than Madame du Montespan. A lot of people really hated Madame du Pompadour. I think because she tried to involve herself a lot more in politics as well. She was great. She was a great patron of the arts. For example, she bought a porcelain factory, which is really cool. But she wasn't so good at politics. She wasn't particularly, let's say, well versed in that world, and so she did mess some things up there. And people were very unforgiving towards that. But now, generally, as historians, we look very favorably upon her, for her role and kind of how good she was to the French people. So things like that were really great. She did have 3 miscarriages in her time before she ceased those sexual relationships. That took a toll on her body. She had a lot of colds. She had a lot of bronchitis and whooping coughs. And unfortunately, something that was very common at the time was she developed TB, which is tuberculosis, or as we call it in England, consumption. And unfortunately, she did succumb to it very young. She was only 42 years old when she passed. It's one of the famous things is that the king actually did look out the window, but it was his best friend who had died, and he cried as the funeral carriage came to take her away, and it was raining, and he said, the weather is not good for her journey today. And he was a chap, as a king, who was very prone to melancholy and depression. More so, it seemed to be a recurring characteristic for all of the Louis kings, but he in particular was very prone to depression. And so after she died, he fell into a deep depression over it. And one of the big scandals was that, after they no longer had that kind of sexual relationship anymore, there was a private harem created for him by staff. A lot of people think that Madame du Pompadour was involved. That is not actually true. It was his staff who created what is known today as Deer Park, and that was on the outskirts of Versailles, and it was where young, uneducated virgins would be taken to sexually pleasure the king. It was very controversial. But Madame du Pompadour, the only thing she did was support it, because it meant that she didn't have to have rivals in court like her predecessors, like Madame du Montespan, had to deal with a lot of rivalry. She didn't have to worry about that so much, but she never actively was involved in creating that. So yes, that was Madame du Pompadour. I still think she's my favorite. She's so charming and charismatic, and I think she was a really great character in history. Actually, Voltaire wrote, and I'll quote this here, when she died, he said, "I am very sad at the death of Madame de Pompadour. I was indebted to her, and I mourn her out of gratitude. It seems absurd that while an ancient pen-pusher such as myself, hardly able to walk, should still be alive, while a beautiful woman such as Madame de Pompadour, in the midst of her splendid career, should die at the mere age of 42. And I tend to agree with Voltaire. I think that's very true. The last famous mistress / courtesan that we're going to be discussing today is Madame du Barry. You may know her more famously than the others for the case of the diamond necklace involving with Marie Antoinette. She was, unlike the other 2 courtesans we're talking about, she was a much more simple girl. She wasn't very well educated. I think the reason that Louis XV really fell in love with her, this was obviously after Madame du Pompadour had died, he really fell in love with her because she was young, and she brought life back into him while he was very depressed. So in that respect, she was a really great thing for the king, and it's really good that she happened to him. However, he was coming towards the end of his life, and Marie Antoinette had come into court because she was to marry the Dauphin, who would later obviously become Louis XVI. And they planned this big wedding, and it was always court protocol that if you were a courtesan, you had to address the queen first. And, you know, we talk about Madame du Montespan, she actively scorned the queen, and that didn't work out well for her. We talk about Madame du Pompadour, she was clever because she actually befriended the queen. She sent the queen flowers at the time, and she knew that if she was clever, she knew if she had the queen on her side, she would do a lot better with the king. And in fact, the queen did make Madame du Pompadour her 13th lady in waiting. That is a true fact. So she did very well. But back to Madame du Barry, who was not so smart. Marie Antoinette took a disliking to her, and whenever she would try to approach the queen, of course she couldn't speak first, the queen denied court protocol and completely ignored her on purpose. And it was a matter of status. She knew, she very much knew that she had to sort of bend her will, and it was completely unheard of at the time because mistresses did hold a very powerful position. Being a courtesan was an influential thing, sometimes more influential than the queen herself. In this case, you know, Madame du Barry was furious, went to Louis, complained that Marie Antoinette would not acknowledge her publicly. Louis was angered, not overly angered, but annoyed, and told someone else, told Marie Antoinette, you know, absolutely have to do this, which very much annoyed Marie Antoinette, but as a newcomer to court, she accepted the position. And of course, at this time, Madame du Barry had only been a courtesan for 1 year to the king, so she was still very new, and it wasn't expected for her to be at some royal affairs, like going to the opera or the theatre, for example, and she did turn up. And eventually, on New Year's Day, and I believe it was 1772, Marie spoke very indignantly to her in a generalized direction, not really at Madame du Barry, but in her general vicinity, and said, "There are many people at Versailles today," thus allowing her to be accepted into court. After this, you know, obviously Louis did die, and one of the downsides of being a courtesan is your position was never secured, and especially if the king died, it was his job to repent on his deathbed and thus send any mistresses away, and this is exactly what happened. Madame du Barry was exiled. Unfortunately, the torment does not end there. She actually, like Marie Antoinette, was executed during the French Revolution, which is very unfortunate. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video today on French courtesans in Versailles. If I make another video on this topic, it will be exclusively for the Venetian courtesan and the arts they had, and why as a courtesan it was important to be able to speak many languages, to paint and dance. And yes, so we'll do that next time. And thank you so much, guys, for checking out this video. And I really appreciate the support, especially on the 2 previous videos. If you have any comments or questions, place them below. And if you have any future topics you'd like me to talk about, just let me know. Take care, guys. Bye.